The last topic that we want to cover during this first week of forest community ecology and succession is confronting this problem of how biodiversity is maintained. This ends up being a more complicated vignette because we have a lot of ground to cover and some of the concepts are a bit more complicated. So what we are trying to do here, though, is understand the role of competition in creating new species, if you will, innovations, and evolutionary innovations, and how we maintain populations. And one of the new theories that we're going to look at in order to get a better idea of this is the theory of island biogeography, which may sound like it has nothing to do with forests, but it answers a lot of questions for us about why particular places have the biodiversity and the species composition that they do. In particular, we're going to talk about this idea of island size, in quotes, and how it is relevant to many systems, in especially things that are not really islands, but act like them, like mountaintops and so forth, you're seeing here. Okay, so let's expand the question a little bit. How is biodiversity created and maintained? There are different branches of ecology that try to deal with this. One is niche theory, and this is in a nutshell postulating that biodiversity is created and maintained by ecological variation and specialization of species to that variation. However, biodiversity can also be created and maintained through heterogeneity, so variation in what you eat or who eats you, and other kinds of variation in light, shade, and temperature. Sometimes this can nest very well into niche theory, and sometimes it's a bit more variable than that because populations and environment varies in time and space. So the creation or adaptation of particular niches may not be, is not set in space. Here's an example of, I think, kind of a, maybe it's a bit of a stretch, but it's an example of application of niche theory. This is white bark pine, and it's been attacked by armillaria. And if you know armillaria and love armillaria, you're not alone. It's, of course, a root pathogen, and it's attacked this tree and knocked it over. Maybe killed it, maybe not. And what's remarkable about this is in the evolution basin it's at, tree line, more or less, and armillaria is there. The niche of armillaria is to attack white bark pine in this case, and it finds it wherever it occurs. So the niches overlap pretty well. Darwin posed this question about how do you maintain biodiversity, and kind of the summary, if you will, to on the origin of species. He described or painted biodiversity and natural systems as an entangled bank. And what he meant by that was, like, where did all these species come from and how did they get all mashed together? He was, of course, trying to answer that on his book on the origin of species. And it turns out, despite that this final passage seems kind of like throwing his hands up in the air, in a great part he had a good theory for teasing a lot of this apart. Biodiversity of plants, including trees, is broad and somewhat random. That's good to keep in mind. There are many ways to adapt to a particular environment. No, most of the time, one adaptation is not going to be clearly superior to another. But adaptations do reflect limiting resources, variation in the environment, interactions with other species, and all of those things are in constant flux. So he wasn't wrong. I think it's a good evocative kind of analogy, an entangled bank. And the only thing that I would add to that is maybe it's like a writhing bank, like this pile of flies here on the shores of Mono Lake, constantly changing and over time, and oftentimes getting more complex. So with that in mind, let's look at the most simple possible and unrealistic model of how biodiversity is maintained, and that's our Lotka Volterra competition dynamics, and we've been talking about this a lot. How is biodiversity maintained? Well, you can maintain it in this toy ecosystem by having intraspecific competition stronger than interspecific competition. That's what you're seeing here. The carrying capacity of these two species is lower than their interspecific competitive effects on each other. We have crossed the streams, total protonic reversal. And if you don't know what total protonic reversal is, you need to be watching Ghostbusters. Okay, anyway, so what goes on here? Well, remember these isoclines are where the rate of population change is 0. So if you're above them, the species, both population change rates of population change are going to decrease. Here they're going to increase. And within these two zones here, they're going to do something a little bit more complicated. But suffice to say, in this example, all roads lead to a stable equilibrium. You don't see this in this figure, but you can imagine this as being like a trough or a pit or something. If you dropped a ball on this surface, it would always roll to this point. This does occur in nature. Intraspecific competition can be stronger than interspecific competition, and it stabilizes biodiversity. Pretty cool, right? So here's the other example of crossing isoclines, and what's a good thing to do here is to look at these 4 zones and ask yourself what's going to happen here. This is a complicated surface because parts of it are flowing down to a single point, and then other parts of it are flowing away from that point. Essentially, this zone and this zone do not do what zones 1 and 3 do, zones 2 and 4. Instead, they're flowing away from that central point. It's not all flowing down into the central point. They're flowing away. It's a complicated surface. If you can think about it in 3 dimensions, it may be easier, but it's going to be hard for me to do with my hands. I'm just look ridiculous. This is called unstable equilibrium. There is an equilibrium point right here, but the system probably cannot stay there. This is a way of maintaining biodiversity because, of course, these are simplifications. These assume the carrying capacity and the interspecific species effects don't change in time. We know that's not true. We know that's not true. That's not how real systems work. They're dynamic. Those things are changing all the time. And because of that, even when you get into this region 4, where it looks like species 1 is going to go extinct, some change in the environment could occur that kicks the whole system back out into this region. It grows towards the unstable equilibrium, and then that can repeat itself quite a lot. Real systems are variable, and environmental fluctuations can help maintain biodiversity. This is just kind of making the same point, and one of the things that you need to do here is kind of challenge yourself to envision how this surface would look in 3 dimensions. Here's an example, another rendering, as these equations are equivalent, and this is just nice, has the arrows on it. It's showing you which direction these things are going to, if you set a ball on here that represented the 2 populations relative to each other, it tells you which direction the ball's going to roll. It's all going to roll into the center in this case. And like I say, a lot of systems are like this. There are systems, this is vaccinium in a redwood forest, pretty dense, but vaccinium and redwood can oftentimes persist. Even though they might compete for some of the same resources, they would compete weakly against each other, especially for light. But they may compete with each other for water, but they're just so weakly it doesn't matter. The intraspecific competition here is much stronger than interspecific competition. But what happens when you have stronger interspecific competition than intra? Well, the surface becomes more complicated. Everything's flowing downhill, if you will, to this point. But once you get there, then it's like you have 2 different paths that the system can roll. The arrows here are kind of helpful for seeing that. Here's an example of that. Grassland and ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. Many parts of coastal forests, especially north of San Francisco Bay, are being invaded. Many grasslands, native grasslands, are being invaded by Douglas fir. It's a conservation problem. In the absence of fire, Douglas fir will oftentimes outcompete grasses. It will invade into these areas and it will colonize grasslands, thereby potentially reducing biodiversity overall at the landscape scale. That's a problem in many places. And particularly challenges that this Douglas fir, even though Douglas fir is a very valuable timber species, this material does not have a very high timber value. In this case, we have probably some sort of unstable equilibrium, maybe one that's competitive exclusion, but without intervention, management, or fire, we're not going to maintain both grasses and Douglas fir. So what's the answer? Well, it's in part management. You got to maintain the species that you care about in some way. If we're not going to burn, or if the system has changed in some way, we have to do that, and there are answers to that. Here's an example. It's nice, gets rid of a lot of the fuels too. Of course, these are expensive. They come with a cost. Now, I also want to just point out here that competitive exclusion in this case, where you would say that like always you're going to have the loss of one species over the other. Competitive exclusion is actually a way that biodiversity can be maintained or even created. Competition favors adaptation. And even though the carrying capacity, there's no competitive advantage for increasing intra-specific competition in this first species, there may be a competitive advantage for increasing of species 2, increasing its interspecific competition with the first species. So these can change, these relationships are not set, they can change. Anyway, so there's one way. Problem with it is it's still a toy model, it doesn't have environmental fluctuations, and it doesn't always, has no scale, it doesn't always represent, in a very intuitive way, a real system. So let's talk about another model that does those things. Landscape ecology is the study of broad-scale processes, how systems are maintained in the large scale, what influences diversity, how it's maintained. And one of our best theories, best tools for understanding this is called the island theory of biogeography. This is a theory that predicts or makes predictions about patterns of biodiversity across land masses. So one of the key things that I want to say first off, one of the key things this does is it predicts a relationship between the number of species in a particular location and the area of the landmass. The number of species in a particular community is expected to increase with the size of that landmass or the size of the habitat and the proximity to an immigration source. So here's Alcatraz Island out in the middle of San Francisco Bay. It's a small island. Is it far away from the land, landmass? What kind of? I mean, it depends on your perspective. But it's a small piece of land. It has biodiversity that reflects both its proximity to land, the larger landmass, and its size. So you can take this information and you can actually build models that predict how many species you would have on particular islands. The predictions are that larger islands tend to hold more species. They have greater diversity. And proximity to the mainland also influences diversity. And the reason for that is because it's influencing the rate at which species can arrive. So one of the ways to maintain biodiversity is just to have a lot of immigration to a particular place. And if an island is close to the land, you're going to have more immigration. This overcomes random extinction of species on a particular island. So let's look at an example. Again, Alcatraz, it's a small island, but it's close to the land. And this means that its biodiversity can be maintained. The biodiversity that it has can be maintained because the birds that live there can live over in San Francisco or Marin County or whatever. It's easy for them to get there. Same is true with the coast live oak and other things that are living on this island. Okay, this is Heard Islands, very remote islands. This Down in the southern oceans, it's a very harsh place, very isolated. It doesn't have plants to live on it, but it has low biodiversity, not just because it's cold and it's a big volcano, but in great part because it's far away. A couple more examples. New Zealand is a relatively large island, but it's kind of far. What ends up happening is that it has a very unique biodiversity. I'll come back to why that is. Madagascar is both a large island. It has both a very unique biodiversity and a lot of biodiversity that's associated with the mainland. It's extremely biodiverse because it has both its own endemic biodiversity and biodiversity that's associated with the mainland. Okay? So far I've been talking about actual islands, but this theory applies in many different kinds of environments because ecologically, many things can act as an island, in quote. Islands can be habitat patches, and on land, these exist in a matrix of habitat. That matrix can vary in quality. This is different from ocean habitats where the ocean may be absolutely inhospitable to something like coastline oak. Better example might be the Kaibab Plateau. Deer can run across the deserts around the Kaibab Plateau and escape into Utah when they run out of aspen. But they can't run off, say, the Hawaiian Islands or something like that. And so the isolation can really matter. And it's different on land. Dispersal, colonizations, constraints apply to isolated areas on land, but they can be modified by the matrix. And we see this, for example, lots of island-like habitat can appear in, say, mountain ranges. They are separated from other patches of, say, whitebark pine by mountain ridges and so forth. But sometimes there are the passes and so forth are relatively low, and there can be easy communication between populations. Here's one of my favorite examples of biogeography on land and how it's relevant. This is the Madrean archipelago. Let's go to Arizona. I love it. The southern Arizona is a series of productive deserts with some very high mountains that punctuate it. Some of my favorites are the Dragoon Mountains. It's got some climbing, Cochise Stronghold, Mount Lemmon, Mount Graham, the Chiricahuas are some places you may have heard of. This is an archipelago of mountaintops that extends throughout the Sonoran Desert, extending into Sonora and New Mexico. They're relatively high mountains. You start down in lowlands, maybe the lowest 3,000 feet. It's going to be desert down there. We get up to as high as 11,000 feet, where you have pine and spruce and fir forests. Not surprisingly, the vegetation is segregated across environmental zones in these mountains. And one of the things that you can see within them is that the size of the particular mountain range and its distance from a source of a founding population or from immigration influences biodiversity. So when you get to these smaller, more isolated mountain ranges, they have lower diversity than the ones that are larger, like the Chiricahuas. Chiricahuas is a relatively big mountain range. It's really diverse place. Okay, last thing to bring up here is this other problem. Predictions are what happens when you have isolated but relatively large islands. Island size also influences the creation of unique parts of biodiversity. In particular, endemic species, what tends to happen is more isolated islands have a higher proportion of endemic species. It's harder for species to establish on those islands, so there's less native but non-endemic species. That means species that did not necessarily evolve in New Zealand or did not evolve in the highlands of southern Spain, which is the example here. You can, the larger in a particular island patch is, regardless of where it is, the more likely you are to have a higher number of endemic species, more opportunity for persistence of unique species within them. you can point to many examples of unique species on islands throughout the world, excuse me, but larger islands are going to tend to have higher endemic species. And therefore, they may have greater overall disproportionate value as conservation resources.